It's my great pleasure to welcome you to what is the 14th annual Theos Lecture and the second we've held online. For those of you who don't know, Theos is a religion and society think tank. We were launched 15 years ago with the support of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, though I'm always at pains to emphasise at the beginning of any talk I do that it was with the warm spiritual support of both of them rather than the hard financial support of either of them. We exist to try and tell a better story about faith in general and Christianity specifically. Better in the sense of more accurate, but also better, we hope, in the sense of more positive, more attractive, or winsome. We conduct research, we write essays, reports, books. We put together brilliant animations, or more precisely, Emily Down, our animator, puts together brilliant animations. We host podcasts and we engage in media debate. Over recent years, we've done work on social cohesion, the future of work, inequality, science and religion, particular favourite of mine, religious freedom, chaplaincy, and of course, on education. Now, education is a topic that often gets onto the media faith agenda in the UK, largely because of ongoing debates about faith schools, church schools, and their admissions procedures. But for well over 10 years now, since the publication of our report, Doing God in Education by Professor Trevor Cooling, we've tried to argue that you can't really begin to grapple with these issues of, if you like, the mechanics of education without first engaging with the deeper underlying debates about what or who education is for. As our recent report, Worldviews in Religious Education, and the brilliant animation by Emily Down puts it, everyone has a worldview. Nobody stands nowhere. Education is so much more than imparting information or even ideas. It's about opening us up and challenging who we are. So it was that when my colleague, and until recently the director of Theos, Elizabeth Oldfield, interviewed Professor Willie Jennings for her podcast, The Sacred, we got an idea. Willie Jennings is an eminent and highly respected theologian. He's Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale University Divinity School and the author of several books. The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race won the Grawemeyer Award in Religion and was called a theological masterpiece by the Inglewood Review of Books. More recently, he wrote After Whiteness, An Education in Belonging, which explores, in his own words, how we form people who form communion. Forming communion is right in our wheelhouse at Theos, and so we were delighted when Willie accepted the invitation to deliver our 2021 annual lecture. For 8 of those lectures now, we have been enormously grateful to be working with CCLA, who have proved to be generous and thoughtful partners. For those of you who don't know them, CCLA have just been confirmed as the largest manager of charity funds in the UK for the 2nd year in a row. They were set up over 60 years ago to serve the interests of mission-driven organisations that were not being well served by the financial services industry. Today, they have over 30,000 church, charity and public sector clients. They provide the secretariat for the Church Investors Group, which represents institutional investors from many mainstream church denominations. And they are ranked top manager of environmental, social and governance investment funds in the UK. And they undertake great work on climate change, obviously at the forefront of all our minds this week, modern slavery and mental health. It's been a great partnership and we are incredibly grateful for it. It's also become a bit of a thing at Theos Annual Lectures to point out that when CCLA first started partnering with Theos, they managed around £5 billion worth. And today that has topped £13 billion. So if anyone watching tonight has any doubts about the benefits of partnering with Theos, I will direct you to our friends at CCLA. The practicalities of tonight's event. I'll shortly hand over to Willie, who will deliver his lecture on Reimagining Western Education in a Time of Racial Crisis. After that, he and I are going to have a short conversation. I'll put some questions to him, and then we will open up the floor, as they say. If you do want to ask a question, please use the Q&A box and not the chat box. The chat box can be distracting, and I think we're going to be turning it off shortly. The Q&A feature will allow the Theos team to read through the various questions that are coming in and hopefully to group them so we can cover as many as possible. And I'll try and put them to Willie in our following conversation. That will last 30 or 40 minutes, and we'll draw stumps promptly at about 9 o'clock. We're broadcasting the event on Zoom and also on YouTube, and the YouTube broadcast will be available to watch again after the live broadcast, but unfortunately we're not able to take questions from YouTube during the lecture. We can be found on Twitter at Theos Think Tank, and if you, there we go, we put it in the chat, and if you want to tag, use hashtag Theos AL21. I'm going to hand over to Willie for the lecture in just 1 minute. And first, I'm going to get him to unmute himself, and I'm going to put a question directly to him. Willie, first of all, it's wonderful to have you with us virtually. If I were to ask you to give us one thing that you would say was the most important element in your own education, what would that be?
Well, Nick, thank you so much for this invitation. And it's such a joy to be with you and to have the opportunity to offer this very important lecture. Well, I would say the one thing, the most important thing, is the gift of being able to ask questions about things that others took for granted. My parents encouraged that in me. And in many ways, they kind of stood out of the way and allowed me to ask questions, especially questions at the site of life contradictions of faith and contradictions of the good of a society, what a society holds up as good and what I could spy out even as a young man as contradictions in that supposedly good thing that the society was putting forward. That's the most important thing.
That's a great answer. Thank you very much. Willie, over to you for the 2021 Theos lecture.
Well, as I said, I want to thank Nick and thank the entire wonderful staff of Theos for this invitation. My friends, I bring you warmest greetings from Dean Gregory Sterling, the faculty, the staff, and the students of Yale Divinity School. It is a joy for me to be here with you, even digitally, in this virtual setting. My topic tonight, as Nick mentioned, is reimagining Western education in a time of racial crisis. How might we build a society rooted in equality, inclusion, and belonging? This has become a crucial question for all of us, given the profound disruptions of communities because of climate change and the ongoing racial and cultural antagonisms that engulf so much of the Western world. This is especially an urgent question for all of those concerned about education in the Western world and those who do the vital work of forming and cultivating people who would be builders. In my time with you this evening, I would like to explore what it would mean to reimagine Western education in this time of crisis, racial crisis, and climate crisis. To educate, my friends, is an act of dreaming. But I have learned in my many years of being in the academy that the dreaming that takes place inside of Western education is profoundly troubled, haunted by the racial condition of the Western world. That haunting comes to rest for us in and through the overarching image of the educated state that we have inherited in Western education. There is an overarching image of formation, what one looks like, when one acts like, when one is educated. And that image is of a white, self-sufficient man who embodies three dismal virtues: possession, control, and mastery. That image haunts Western education, bringing a tormenting spirit that presses pulls us to form ourselves into this white, self-sufficient man. I've experienced and watched that haunting in my many years in higher education as an academic dean, a faculty member, and as a student, and in many years as a consultant to schools across the US and in Canada and other parts of the world around a whole host of matters, from diversity training to doctoral student formation, from curricular development to even conflict management. I have listened carefully as faculty, administrators, and staff, students shared with me their anguish mixed with their joy, their anger and frustration mixed with their determination, their doubting mixed with their commitment, and our shared inability to capture in words something that we all sensed haunted the educational institutions we inhabited. Uncoupling ourselves from that damaging, overarching image of formation requires we aim education in a different direction for dreaming, if you will, away from the white, self-sufficient, masculinist intellectual form and towards something else, something that has been banished, in fact, from the work of teaching, the work of education, the work of intellectual cultivation. And that is the idea of belonging. As a Christian theologian, I want to get at the idea of belonging through an alternative image that is available to all of us for the work of dreaming. It is an image that we have ignored and also banished beyond the work and walls of the academy. That alternative image, that alternative overarching image of who and how one should be as an educated person turns our attention to Jesus and the crowd, that motley, unruly mass of people who are together only because of Jesus. Jesus gathers a crowd. Now, the crowd, my friends, is not Christian, and thusly the image should not be seen as exclusively Christian. It is, however, the basis on which a Christian could form, but more specifically to our concerns at this moment, it is the basis on which life together, rich life together, could form. This alternative image of formation is cultivating the ability and disposition to gather people together, people who would never imagine themselves being together. But here they are together because of you. Whether you are aiming to become a doctor or a nurse or an architect or a pharmacist or a plumber, what you announce by the way you do your work is not a white, self-sufficient, masculinist presence that always tries to exhibit possession, control, and mastery, but someone who facilitates belonging. People coming to know one another as they come to know you. What would it mean to aim the dreaming, which is inherent to education, toward belonging? To answer this urgent question requires we do three things. First, we must face the dreaming that has come to us through whiteness. Secondly, we must rethink the life of possession. And then finally, we must renew an ethic of sharing. But first, whiteness. For some people, to even say the word whiteness already borders on hate speech. But to speak of whiteness is to speak of a historical process of identity reconstruction. Whiteness, my friends, is not phenotype. It is not first appearance or biology or culture, and certainly not a part of God's creation. Whiteness is a way of seeing the world and a way of being in the world at the same time. Whiteness is a way of organizing the world, making sense of the world. And whiteness is having the power to order one's world by that effort. Whiteness, let's say, in this moment, whiteness is an engine of aspiration. So when we say a white self-sufficient man, we're not talking about a particular person or a person of the past or the present, but an invitation offered to everyone, male or female or non-binary person of every ethnicity, class or social status or nationality, anyone and everyone touched by Western education. It is an invitation that we all encounter at some point early in our careers in the academy. This is where the desires that brought us into the academic space, into our educational journey, meet the desire made known to us in the academy, the desire of the master to form sons who will learn how to be masters. You see, it was the master's dream, the modern colonialist master's dream, that gave birth to this tragic, white, self-sufficient, masculine image. Self-sufficiency has to do with the legacy of the magnanimous man, the man who, inspired by the logic of Stoicism, lives a balanced life, never giving to the extremes of gluttony, lust, anger, or emotion. He is one who never apologizes for his strength and his decisiveness, but always uses his power for the good. He is one who makes no excuses for weakness. It is this sense of self-sufficiency that shows up throughout the colonial world, in the encomiendas, the haciendas, and especially the plantations of the New World. The most important person on the plantation was the master owner. He was the racial paterfamilias. Paterfamilias is a Greek term that refers to the elder father figure who in ancient Hellenistic societies was in charge of the household and organized it according to his life, his desires, and especially his dreams. On the plantation of the colonial world, on the plantations of the colonial world, the father master looked out on his world and asked one crucial question: who will care for my colonial holdings and my legacy after I am gone? He then looked at his sons and sometimes at his daughters with that same question in mind and added a layer to it. Another question: who must they become in order to carry forward my holdings and my legacy and even expand them into eternality? They must become white, self-sufficient men, able to show in body and in mind, in action and reaction, control, possession, and mastery. They must be able to control their passions and urges, their anger and enthusiasm. They must be in possession of strong minds and bodies, and able to maintain possession of what they have been given and what they will inherit. And they must be prepared to face the unknown with a commitment to its mastery, and from one obstacle to the next, to go from mastery to mastery. They must show their finish. This finish is the beginning to life with power, a life that begets power, aims for profit and productivity, and a promise to be a builder. Between the desire of the master father and the aspirations of the master's children, educational institutions formed and institutions formed. The colonial masters formed education in the new worlds and refashioned education in the old worlds of Europe to answer that crucial question. Modern Western education was formed in plantation desire. The desire of the masters to form their sons and sometimes their daughters to handle power in ways that would translate into continued mastery of their environments, and especially the colonial holdings of their fathers and grandfathers. These were men formed to enact their power without apology or pride for the common good. Even as society shifted away from legal slavery and unabashed plantation life, the structural realities of Western education remain not only intact, but translatable and translated into every colonial site, embedding itself deeply into the institutional subconscious of the Western Academy. So this legacy of dreaming men who attain power and can handle power becomes so compelling and intoxicating for educational institutions and educators. Like drug addicts whose ways of being in the world have been contorted by the desire for the drug, our ways of being in educational institutions have been contorted by the desire to exhibit the control, possession, and mastery of this man. I offer you a poem entitled Windows. Please, please fear poor men who are smart. Be terrified of bright women who were raised in lack. These people are dangerous inside thinking walls where they feel the power of thought that can make them pastless and thoughtfully thoughtless, free now to rationalize their hungers. They are fit for making walls, destroying doors for all who might take their gain and return them poor. Their only hope now, those windows not quite fit for the frame, with seeping sunlight and invading cold air, keeping the room feeling outside so everyone can see their breathing. How do we begin to overcome this legacy? We must face the dreaming born of whiteness, the dreaming of the master aiming for eternality in his children, an eternality formed by control, possession, and mastery. We must turn aspiration in a different direction toward belonging. Yet, this is where the idea of belonging must be refashioned as an antidote to the possessive logics that have been lodged in Western societies and their educational institutions. To do this refashioning, we have to look once again at the colonial masters and the horrific transformations they brought to the world by considering one word, possession. We must rethink the idea of possession. We mentioned it a moment ago as one of those dismal virtues of the white self-sufficient man, but now we must single it out as a place where belonging has been historically distorted. The idea of possession is as ancient as is the social life for plants, animals, and humans. But from the beginning of the modern colonial period in the 15th century, the idea of possession began to shift, especially in Christian thought, because it was shifting in Christian practice. What William Cronin noted in his classic text, Changes in the Land, about the Native Americans of New England beginning in the 17th century, could be said about indigenous peoples all over the world in their encounter with European colonialists. They found themselves surrounded by people who had a strange new way of thinking possession. These invading European Christians saw possession through break, separation, and enclosure, where native groups saw possession through continuum, connection, and overlap. The former, a possession of; the latter, a possession by. The former made a claim on something. The latter was claimed by something. This is no small difference, my friends, because between these two ways of imagining possession, one world is being destroyed and another world is being created. The indigenous world being destroyed articulated claims to things inside the logic of a commons, but not a commons in the sense of early Europeans to the New Worlds who imagined the commons as small islands of shared land in a sea of feudal holdings. This indigenous commons is everywhere, and each people may have claim to this or that place to hunt or gather food or celebrate or deliberate or listen to the elders or the animal kin. This common touches tools for use in a logic of sharing, and it touches bodies in shared concern. It also involves a kind of reciprocity with animals and plants and seasons, each requiring attentiveness and respect. Now, of course, it does not preclude violence or theft or dispute over lands or oppression. It narrates such horrors when narrations are given through violations of the commons and attacks on communal or even covenantal bonds. The world being created by the colonialists articulated claims to things inside the logic of control. Now, most historians of these periods and decolonial theorists see this as a logic of commerce. They are correct, but short-sighted, because commerce follows control, and control has to do with making my world manageable, understandable, and containable. These are the terms through which to see the long deployment of European pastoral practices and agricultural sensibilities in the New Worlds. It was those practices and sensibilities that shaped their aggressive reformatting of landscapes of the New World and determined their assessment of native life, an aggressive assessment that reaches into our very moment. The colonial settlers reached two ominous conclusions about native life in the land. First, native peoples did not know how to cultivate specific lands to make them properly productive. That is, they did not know how to properly farm, properly build habitation. And secondly, they should be seen in possession of only those lands that were being cultivated and improved, only those lands that were being made productive and profitable. The cultivation and improvement of the land reached all the way to the body, as indigenous peoples the world over were being forced to live inside constraining visions of ownership. Tragically and ironically, we have come to understand and accept those very constraining visions as the basis of our own freedom. At the heart of constraining visions of ownership is one fundamental idea, that possession activates one's right to exist and one's freedom. To claim oneself was to possess oneself, and to claim your existence as a people required you lay claim to some piece of land as the space for your cultivation and productivity. Through this vision of possession, ownership and existence were coupled together and made a crucial foundational aspect of self-determination and self-expression. So possession of land and possession of ourselves formed in modernity as two sides of the same coin. This vision of possession shapes the way we understand productivity and use and value and voice and even human worth. This vision of possession drives the idea really of a destructive freedom. I can do whatever I wish with whatever I own. My friends, Western education is caught up in performances of self-possession that build directly out of this colonial logic. Indeed, we aim students in and toward this reality of self-possession as the basis of self-actualization. We constantly configure education as initiation into ownership of knowledge, of self, and the means through which to deepen and widen ownership in this world. Let me be clear. I don't want to take away freedom or choice. Yet what if we aim students in a different direction in order to understand what it means to choose, what it means to be free? What if we aligned education with an ancient sense of possession, of being possessed by, of being woven into the fabric of connectivity and belonging? The language I would suggest we use for this would also be ancient language, and that is the language of calling. Calling. The Latin phrase here is vocatio, from which we derive the word vocation. Yet at the heart of a calling is listening, Another poetic offering for us entitled Refuse. Do you hear the calling from the old nothing? From a new nothing, not the old one, born of robbery and lack, but the nothing out of which came that voice speaking light to see clearly the beginning of a new day, of rubble turned to hill and lifting head, and in an instant make refuse the stuff of freeing legend, to glory thine be and belong. Calling is about sensing and discerning belonging, and a life that reflects belonging. But the sense of belonging we need at this urgent moment enfolds the old inside the new. The new is a sense of belonging that creates the common. The calling is to become the commons, to be the place of meeting, of gathering, where people who would not talk to one another must now talk together because we are there, because you are there. Belonging is the calling that must be heard through education, and not the call of the master to form sons, or the voice of the sons and daughters aiming to become him. At the heart of such a commons is a renewed ethic of sharing. The ethic of sharing has gone missing from the very beginning of the modern colonial moment. The colonialists believed that God had given them the new worlds to possess in order to bring the new worlds to full maturity. The colonialists were convinced they knew best what to do with the world, the land, the plants, the animals, the landscape, how best to steward its development. Their deliberations and calculations, as far as they were concerned, did not need the knowledge, wisdom, or voice of the indigenous peoples, especially not the voice of the land itself or the animals. Their vision of possession silenced the world, and it was a racial silencing, as non-white bodies were silenced. The colonialists envisioned the land inside the market instead of seeing the market inside the land. The reality of a market where people trade and buy and share the good gifts of the earth, recounting to each other the growth journeys of their crops, was replaced by the dream of a market that would make some rich and increase their power. The transatlantic market, soon to become the global market, would dictate what the land should be used for, what the people would be good for, and what kind of life would be permitted. This dreaming, this terrible dreaming, is yet with us, yielding a horrible nightmare that too few of us even see as a nightmare. These are the colonialist seeds that strangled an ethic of sharing. On the one hand, that legacy of colonial dreaming silences communal voices and of use and or development or cultivation of anything and everything. And on the other hand, it renders us silent in the face of market forces and economic engines. When it comes to the markets, my friends, when it comes to the markets and land and real estate and development, we all act like 19th century deists who believe that God dropped the world as possession into our hands and simply walked away, saying to us, let the bankers and the markets and the finance people and the economists work out all the details of life. What must be done? Well, many things, but I want to point to only one thing at this moment. We must renew an ethic of sharing, which means for us challenging the idea of the private in property and challenging individualistic sensibilities and ownership that teach us to ignore the ramifications of the buying and selling of land. Can we, in listening to our indigenous siblings, enter into a deeper sense of accountability to the places we inhabit? Could we begin our deliberations about money and finance by asking who is missing from the conversation and the decision making that will affect so many people? I close by returning to that alternate image I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture of Jesus and the crowd, that strange collection of people, friends, enemies, strangers, Gentiles and Jews, who were only together because they wanted something that only Jesus could give them. The promise of a revolutionary new life, economically, politically, or socially, and the hope of healing that could not be found anywhere else. Jesus and the crowd is an image that does not present an imperial position from which to think, listen, and learn, but a reality of chaos where the lack of control, possession, and mastery meets Jesus and his disciples. The crowd cannot be made self-sufficient. The crowd cannot be made self-sufficient. Indeed, the crowd exposes the truth that Jesus and his disciples are joined with them in need for God's help. And in so doing, it is the crowd that opens his body to become a place of the commons. Jesus's body became a place of the commons and the site for a new reality of belonging. The final poem I would like to share, entitled Sensing Many. Before the confession, here was crying out. Before the teaching, here was feeling terror. Before the word spoken, here was longing for. You have heard it said. Here now, breathing, reaching, waiting, people sensing the many. Salvation beginning. There is a vision of the commons that yet calls out for embodiment, my friends. There is a vision of belonging that gives witness to thriving life and even to life with the living God. We have reached a moment when such a vision is absolutely necessary if we wish to turn the work of building society and cultivating builders of society away from the white self-sufficient man and toward life together. Thank you very much.
I will unmute myself. I've only been doing this for 18 months or so. I couldn't get used to it. Willie, thank you ever so much for a lecture that was poetic and powerful and provocative. We already have a number of questions coming in, and I would ask people to continue bringing them in. It's great to see them. I'm going to kick off with a couple of mine, but as it happens, they already hoover up one or two of the points that people are already making in the Q&A. So let me start with what is quite a specific, almost a terminological question. You introduced the topic of whiteness by saying that for many people, it's an unfamiliar, even a threatening term. You made it very clear that it isn't intended to denote being phenotypically or ethnically white, but rather as a way of seeing and organizing the world. I think that was the phrase you used. I have a fear that many people, in spite of that, will naturally hear it in a more narrowly ethnic or phenotypic way. And if they do, you're at risk of, say, alienating people who are otherwise very sympathetic to your analysis of the problem of self-sufficiency in education and indeed in wider anthropology. So what would you say to those who feel that the word itself, whiteness, is, if you like, needlessly provocative, given the sense of commonality that you want to build?
Excellent question. I love this question. It's often asked. We have to understand it as a necessary diagnostic tool. It is a tool like a doctor says, if you want me to fix that tooth, I've got to use this. This is the tool we need. And what does it do? It points us to a history interrupted, Nick. That's the best way to put it. So for all people of color, not in all the same way, but for all people of color, there's a process that all of us in the Western world have had to go through to some greater or lesser degree. And what is that process? That process is to distinguish between who we are and the racial vision of who we are that's been given to us. Blackness or Asianness or Latinxness, whatever, however we've been described, that there is a negotiation that each of us and all of us have to go through to distinguish who we are from that racial image. Now, here's the complex beauty of it. For so many people, what they have to do is go through the painful process of pulling out the small slivers that do speak to who they actually are, but have been placed in this massive mangle of derogatory, horrible, destroying, toxic ways of imagining oneself. That painful work of pulling it out, and having on this side of that reality who they are, looking at this horrible mirror image that really is a distorted, mangled reality, and every people struggling with that. Now, what we have to understand is that whiteness formed in the exact opposite of that. In fact, whiteness is the engine, in a sense, that formed that. And whiteness is the exact opposite of that. Whiteness is not presented as a mangled, distorted, horrible, terrible, derogatory vision. It's presented as something beautifully, beautifully seamless, perfectly aligned with a life, and desirable. So it's as though it's like two sides of my hand, they fit so perfectly. But that side is horribly damaging, not only to the rest of the world, but to the very people who have been perfectly aligned with it. So when someone like me and the many others who over the centuries have done this, who come along and say, separate that, pull at that. Oh my goodness, that is incredibly painful. Why? Because if it's been seen as positive, normative, desirable, and let's add one more word, pleasurable, then for me to say, pull it apart, what will be the response? Pain, screaming, hurt, anger, because no one wants to pull apart something that's been seen as pleasurable and positive. So the challenge is for anyone who wants to be serious about overcoming the racial condition, a serious work of interrogation, of questioning, of challenging, of pulling apart who they are from this reality of whiteness is absolutely necessary. And the good news is that we are surrounded. The world is full of people who can say, come, I can help you do this. I do it every day. And so it's not as though we're sending people off to some remote island to figure this out by themselves. They can do it with others. But it is crucial what you pointed out, because for so many people, just to talk about it, to name it, already brings pain, already brings discomfort, because we're asking folks now for the first time to make a distinction that they've never had to make before.
Thank you. That was a very full answer. We've got loads of questions coming in, and I'm trying to keep an overview of them, but I'm going to insert one more of my own before I draw in a few others. And it's another provocative question, if you like. I know you'll like those, Willie. You say very clearly that mastery is a problem. It's a dismal virtue. Let me put an alternative thought to you. Last year, I spent far longer than I ever wanted to in a cancer hospital. And all the time I was there, I wanted the consultants I was dealing with to have complete mastery over what they were doing, complete mastery over the drugs they were administering. I wanted them to be in control, to be certain. And indeed in many other areas of life, arts and craft and so on and so forth, we've historically associated with mastering your skill as an admirable thing. So my provocation is, isn't mastery actually quite a good thing after all?
This is a great question, Nick. I'm often asked this question. And you know, I think about it. I think about a wonderful doctor. I think about a wonderful musician, a great violinist. And we all know that when you are in the presence of greatness, when you're in the presence of greatness that is woven into wisdom, here's what we all know will happen. If you ask a great violinist, if you ask a great doctor, if you ask anyone who is clearly celebrated for what they do you have mastery? Almost inevitably, they will say to you, have you lost your mind? Of course, because they know the very idea that they have mastery is a fundamental denial of the wisdom of what it means to have given oneself to a craft. So now, but let's push it further. It's a horrible thing to be in the presence of someone who, if you ask that question, will say, well, yes, I do. Because then you're in the presence of someone who's incredibly dangerous. When my wife and I were having our first child, we were in a hospital room and my wife was in great pain and we were waiting for the nurse to bring the epidural. And 5 young doctors in white coats came into the room. They were, they were the best of the best because of my former institution, the medical school was really highly rated. They were the best of the best. They came into the room. They were very smart. They walked into the room. They came 2 feet from my dear wife, who was in terrible pain. I'm in pain, watching her in pain, waiting for the nurse to bring the epidural. They looked at her, looked at me, didn't say a word. They looked at the machines, they looked at the charts, and then they huddled together 2 feet from us and discussed my wife as though she was a living cadaver. Nick, I was so upset. I was ready to take my chair and throw it at them, but my wife needed my attention. Thankfully, the nurse came in, and the nurse said to the doctors, "Would you mind stepping out of the hallway? I have to administer the epidural." Thank God for the nurse. And then she looked at me and she just shook her head and she just said, "Doctors." And then what she said was, "Very smart, but very dumb."
Lovely. We've had a number of questions in around the delineation of colonialism. I'm going to pick one of them from Jane, which is what's included in the understanding of modern colonial world. Is it effectively a North Atlantic thing? Would it have included, or would it include the Ottoman Empire, the USSR, the Japanese or Chinese empires? Can you reflect a little bit on what effectively colonialism means?
Great question. And so we want to specify that the colonialism we're referring to is not the general idea of conquest and seizure that one could imagine throughout history. We're referring to a particular reconfiguration of the world from the 15th century forward, colonialism that is tied to modern slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, colonialism that is tied to the expansion of European empires, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, the French, a little bit of the German, the Americans. We're thinking of colonialism in that way, but most importantly, to help the listener understand what we're specifying, we're talking about the colonialism out of which the racial imagination formed, the modern racial imagination. Coming back to that first question, the colonialism that created the idea for so many people that to even say the word white is problematic, is offensive, is difficult. That's what we're trying to get our minds around. We recognize that there have been oppressions long before modern colonialism and long after modern colonialism, but we're talking about something much more specific than oppression. We're talking about something much more specific than the history of destructive forces. We're talking about a kind of building and creating that grew inside destroying. That's why this is so important for us. A building and institutionalizing that was energized by the destroying.
And because I've told you this bit beforehand in our communication, that one of the particular ideas and phrases that I really love in the lecture, when you're again talking about Jesus, his body was a place of the commons and a site for a new reality of belonging. And I just see that because I want to ask a question from Ao here, who says, in my church, it seems that the idea of possession is being shared through ideas such as taking possession of the land for Jesus, or expanding our tents or expanding our territory to bring God's kingdom. How do we push back against this idea when it's said to be a Christian or biblical thing to do?
Yeah, this is a part of a long tragedy of as I understand, misreading the Bible. We have been trained, all of us, Nick, in the West, those of us who are Christian, we've been trained to come to the Bible with an idea in our hearts and minds that is not there. The idea of private property as we understand it, and the land being silent, the land just being dirt. Whereas when you read the scriptures, in both the Older Testament and the New Testament, when you read it, the land is alive, it's animate and communicative. And so if we think of the land as alive and communicative, and not only that, in relationship to God, with us, but also apart from us, then we're able to attune ourselves to the richer dynamics that are present in the biblical witness. That is, that the land is also witness of God's life, but witness to us of God, that the land is watching us, the animals are watching us, and that we live in a reciprocity. That means the way we talk about possession has to be changed. The problem for so many people is that when they look in scripture, they see the mirror of the colonial problem, which is they see Israel, they see every story inside the same kind of relationship we have with land now, which is odd, utterly odd.
That there are actually kind of two directions that that question leads me. And I kind of want to ask both, but they're slightly different. So I'm going to ask the first one, and hopefully I can also squeeze the second one in. We're having this conversation during COP26, of course, when the world is staring at Glasgow. Dorothy has asked a question about how can we move COP26, and then she tellingly says COP27 and COP28, because this is an ongoing process. How can we move them away from the self-sufficient white man? I guess this is rooting your lecture back in this critical idea of not just racial crisis, but environmental crisis. And that links to your previous point about scripture and nature as well. Reflect on that for us, please.
Yes, we've reached a crucial moment when the ideas of understanding land as not only possessed, but bordered is profoundly problematic in our ability to address this crisis. There's a common wisdom among so many indigenous peoples that it's important to understand, because it's also present in the scripture. Our sense of connectivity has a direct bearing on our sense of relationality. And this is incredibly important to understand. And without, as so many indigenous intellectuals have told us, without a clear, healthy sense of connectivity, that I'm connected to the land and we're connected to each other because we're connected to the land. And by connected, it's not a matter of sentimentality or ownership, but we are fundamentally connected to the land. And in scripture, we are of dirt. Without a healthy sense of connectivity, then whatever understanding of relationality we have will be shallow. We will see relationality as optional, right? If I don't want to be bothered with you, I can simply walk away. What happens across your property line, your border, is your business, is not mine. Relationality is only volitional. But when you have a healthy sense of connectivity, you realize, no, relationality is an absolute clear responsibility because of connectivity. But in the West, especially, and we can think about it in any neighborhood, we have been taught to think the line, Nick. We've been taught to think the line. What do I mean by that? We've been taught to think that our moral obligations end where our property line ends. What goes on across the property line is none of my business. That's my neighbor's. That has nothing to do with me. And the reality is that's a fiction. The property line is a fiction. Even if it's a property line reinforced by barbed wire, it's still a fiction. The border is a fiction because the water falls on both sides. The air flows through both sides. The dirt is the same. The animals If they can, they'll move from place to place. But it's precisely the habits of mind formed by educational processes and reinforced by the built environment that underwrite the lie. So what does this mean? It means that right now, the difficulty we're having with the climate conversations is that so many people still believe that relationality is only volitional and connectivity is not existent. It's inconsequential. When in point of fact, if we followed indigenous wisdom, we would understand that that makes no sense. And what so many people are struggling over right at this moment is trying to convince a Western world that there is only one planet. And that's not a slogan, but it remains a slogan if one does not have a healthy sense of connectivity. And as a theologian, I would say the way we help to reestablish a healthy sense of connectivity is by reanimating our theological imaginations, our religious imaginations for so many people. There we can finally return to the truth, the reality of a world in which we are of the dust.
That answer does allow me, I'm very grateful, to shoehorn in that second question I wanted to, because you did talk about property there, and of course that's a critical issue when we're talking about connectivity and responsibility. John is one of the people who's asked about property and said property rights are central to Western social structure. So what alternative do you envision to Western property rights within your vision of community and connectivity?
We have to return to the rough ground. What is promised by life in the land? What's promised by life in the land is not only survival, but thriving. We convinced and this goes back to a number of very important theorists working obviously with a number of other agents and factors, but we convinced people that the precursor to thriving, the prerequisite for surviving and thriving is ownership. Now, Nick, you and I know, and I think all of your listeners know, that there was a time when people didn't have that particular formulation, that ownership was not the precursor to surviving or thriving. Shared use was the prerequisite. Sharing was the prerequisite. My people coming to hunt here for this season and then moving on, your people coming to hunt at that season and then moving on, we coming to the water together to fish. Obviously still conflict, difficulties, but we understood that we were in a shared economy and an ethic of sharing. And our wise ones, if they were wise, taught us how to share. But let's also keep another thing in mind. And here's where I want your listeners to make sure they understand the difference here. What has been the greatest result in our world with this new reality of possession that we normalize? The greatest reality that's been created is something called trash. You have trash as the ultimate result of a world thought through possession. And trash speaks to us, haunts us, not of our mistakes, but trash haunts us because trash is the result of possession working perfectly. And what we all must come to grips with is that unless we understand how to reverse a waste culture, then there is no hope. But I do believe we can reverse a waste culture, but it cannot happen as long as we think the prerequisite for thriving and surviving is ownership.
I did want to ask about the commons, because
Yes.
it's obviously central to the lecture, and it's a subject I find really, really interesting and fascinating. I'm particularly motivated by the work of the late economist Eleanor Ostrom,
Yes.
who probably did more than anyone else to put the study of the commons on a serious academic footing. And her sometimes very detailed empirical work showed that common resources, or common pool resources, as she talked about them, could be successfully governed and used and managed, and without trash and waste and so on and so forth, but only usually through quite a long list of conditions, including things like effective monitoring and graduated sanctions within a carefully delineated group. Sometimes, not in your lecture, but sometimes we do talk about the commons in a slightly naive way, as if everyone shared and everyone was happy. But actually, if we're serious about managing the commons, governing the commons, we do need actually quite strict and careful governance, don't we? This doesn't happen by itself. Commons resources very often provoke pretty intense disputes. How do you deal with those? And particularly, how do you deal with them in such a global perspective?
This is a great question. And there are so many indigenous peoples who, if they were on this Zoom with us right now, they would be jumping up and down. And the first thing they would say is, would you mind talking to us? Because we appreciate the expert that you've noted, but many of us have collective wisdom on how to do this very complex work that none of you have ever paid attention to. And they would also say that, in fact, you need often what is resisted in the West. And that is, let's use loose language here, a spirituality, a theological vision, a religious vision, a moral vision that helps to narrate what it means to live in the world with others, so that one does not approach this, and I'm going to use theological language. One does not approach the commons contractually. One approaches the commons covenantally. And here's what's key for those listening who know anything about theology, but I'll try to be very brief as a theologian and not bore your listeners. But the difference between contract and covenant is very important here. Theologically, covenant means that there is a life together, an obligation of life together that is permeated with grace, that is permeated with a desire to be together no matter what. And so the contractual elements, you do this and I'll do that, are undergirded by this reality of a life given to one another. God gives God's life to us. God offers this freely, not because we've done something, and therefore inside of that, there's kind of contractual elements, but it is not contract. So a commons has to be understood covenantally, Nick. It has to be understood inside of a grace-filled life of sharing, right? This is the idea behind tithing. This is the idea behind giving. You are giving out of a deep sense of gratitude and thankfulness for what you have. And that becomes the internal engine of an economic vision. That's what's required before, as you said when you first began, that's required before the mechanics of it all. And for so many, but now, of course, as I said earlier, for so many indigenous peoples, if they were in this Zoom with us right now, they would all be saying, well, if you paid attention, we've been trying to do this. In fact, we were doing this very well before the world showed up and destroyed the possibilities. And here, let me just say this before we go to the next question, because this is really important. One of the tragedies that I noted indirectly in my lecture is when so many indigenous peoples were forced is the word, to think of their land as property. They were forced to think of the land no longer as a living part of them that, in a sense, they shared with others in listening to the land. They were forced to talk about it, think about it, and pass it on to their children as a thing, as a commodity, in order for them to exist. And it's precisely that problematic way of beginning that makes the commons such a difficult idea for so many people.
Thank you. We've had a number of questions about, well, two things really that are linked. Obviously, education. There are quite a few educationalists in the audience. And also about the concept of the West, Western education. So I want to ask two questions, picking up on some of the questions that are in the Q&A at the moment. Now, one is that the role of the colonial master or owner, obviously very, very central to your argument, and one that has very powerful resonance in the US and in particular in certain states in the US. In Western Europe, and especially in the UK, it's tended to be class that's been the main lens through which we have cemented social hierarchies. And for example, in Britain, modern education was formed not in plantation desire, but through church schools, sometimes for genuinely liberating reasons, sometimes as a mean of inculcating social obedience in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. So in the light of that, how transferable are your arguments across the Atlantic, given those different structures and hierarchy as a background to education?
That's a great question. I've spoken with people all over, and I do mean literally all over, who have resonated with some of these ideas as I shared in my After Whiteness book. And here's where I think the points of confluence are. When we ask the question, what does the formation look like? What does it yield? What is the person able to exhibit? How do they show their finish? At that moment, I do think you're right in terms of different dynamics at play everywhere. But in terms of what the goals of formation are, then we're talking very often about a very similar set of desires. And it's those set of desires that we want to focus on. What the educated person looks like, how they perform. And here's, it goes back to the lecture, what they have banished in that performance. It's like you were saying earlier, when you said, I want a doctor who has mastery. And that reality has been translated in so many other places, right? But as I said earlier, the wise doctor would never want that for himself or herself. So yeah, so in that regard, we are looking at a similar set of desires having been executed and then embodied in individuals who have achieved the educated state and aim their life towards showing their finish.
Well, that neatly leads me on to my second kind of question about education, which is more, if that was, as it were, the theoretical premises, this is more the objectives, the end point. And a number of people have asked about this, not surprisingly, as I said, because I think we've had quite a few educationalists in the audience. So I'm going to pick one from Ben, who says, what would your vision of redirecting education towards belonging, which I love, mean for the practices of assessment in the academy?
Great question. Oh, great question. Well, so, and I want to commend to Ben my book, After Whiteness. I have a chapter on this. And what it would mean is that we do some better backward design in turn. Now I'm going to get into the weeds a bit for educational theorists. So those who are not, please have patience with me. But we're going to do a bit of backward design. And we're going to ask some crucial questions about how do we design for three crucial things, Nick. How do we design for attention? How do we design, and that is to cultivate attention? How do we design to cultivate affection? And how do we design to cultivate resistance? Resistance to injustice, resistance to oppression, and so forth. How do we design? So if we start with thinking, in a sense, kind of backward design, thinking about what the learning experiences we're trying to design, then what we do is we can turn and bring the proper critique to the sick forms of evaluation that exist in the Western world. Nick, after I published After Whiteness, I've heard from people from all over the US, all over Canada, all over Latin America, all over Australia, all over New Zealand, the UK, all talking to me about the kinds of evaluations that they have gone through, the torture they have gone through, the internalized forms of horrible evaluation, self-evaluation, evaluation of their work, their writing, their thinking, their arguments. And here's the thing, they all speak of a similar brutality that's imagined necessary for the formation of a rigorous mind. That's the problem. But you can't get at that problem without backing up to think about, what does it mean to cultivate attention? What does it mean to cultivate affection and resistance? So that we have to get at, because evaluation is where the white self-sufficient man lives most powerfully.
I think I heard a cheer when you said sick forms of evaluation from hundreds of people who were watching. I suspect that particularly resonated. I want to ask a background question. This is from Peter, and I think it's an interesting one, particularly for me, who's particularly fascinated by this period of history. What's the relationship between the white self-sufficient man and the Enlightenment? Is it an inevitability or a corruption and distortion of the Enlightenment?
Well, I would not. I know there are many people who have many dogs in the fight over the value, historically and ongoing value of the Enlightenment. I choose not to enter into that fight, because we are here, and we are here on the other side of its results. But here's what we want to understand. The self-sufficient man was the vehicle for aspiration. And so to the extent that the Enlightenment helped to solidify certain trajectories of aspiration of what we might become, the self-sufficient man became the crucial vehicle to carry forward those trajectories. And so self-sufficiency, for so many people, as I said in the lecture, self-sufficiency wove itself then into the possessive logics and the very ideas of self-possession as at the heart of self-actualization and the claiming of my freedom. And so to the extent that we want to define Enlightenment virtues along the lines of freedom, self-determination, and so forth, we are lurking in the room with the self-sufficient man. And he might come over and put his arm around us and say, welcome home.
This is the second Theos Annual Lecture that we've had online. It's great in one sense because we can listen to people who are thousands of miles away from us. But I think you would agree, and many people would agree, that being in the same room, there's something very valuable to it.
Absolutely.
And we've had a number of questions about the internet and teaching online, not least, I guess, because millions and millions of students, their vulnerable embodiment is central to your argument, central to your concept of anthropology. I worry that's a bit ominous, or rather the signs are a bit ominous at the moment, because we seem to be witnessing the virtualization of everything, from money and communication to community, education, even love. Is the headlong rush towards virtual communication, virtual existence, is that effectively undermining everything you seek to achieve about our shared commonality?
It could be, but here's what we want to remember, and this comes back to a kind of basic truth of the creature, that we are formed to create webs, to create the fabric of connectivity, create the fabric for communion. And so to the extent that we can use whatever means are necessary to continue to weave that fabric, we have to see that as an outgrowth of really who we are. I mean, we can tie this, we can go back to letter writing and we can understand that if it's isolatable, then obviously it becomes problematic. And of course, as we were talking about earlier, we are always at the site of the commodification of everything. And commodification requires isolation. But if there is the possibility of withholding the energies of commodification and drawing all our efforts toward the creating of fabrics of communion, then yeah, we could make use of this. But I think many of us learned a very valuable lesson during the pandemic, and we're still in the pandemic. And that is, while I have been on the screen with my students teaching class, this year now that we're back together, there's a level of healing that is taking place that did not make the time on the screen inconsequential, but it made the time on the screen tied to the necessary time together. And so I do think there are possibilities of the weaving happening. But again, I'm repeating myself here, we have to be always on guard against the commodification and the isolation. There's something terribly wrong with a life that shuns others.
On commodification, I've got a question here, which I'll read out. Too often, the vision governments ask the academy to pursue is creating workers skilled to advance the economy. How would you try to persuade the followers of such a vision that education is about belonging? And I think the phrase to emphasize there is persuading the followers of such a vision, because we're able to talk in a lecture like this of commonality and of deeper anthropological concerns. But if you're in policy, you are very often, you don't have time for those kind of discussions. So I guess the implication of that question is, how do you persuade people who are within this commodified mindset and know that a country needs to compete economically, that actually your vision for education isn't just a nice to have, but a realistic option in the world today?
It's about humanization. And some of this many parts of industry understands. Unfortunately, they're trying to commodify it to get back to our problem. But the truth of the matter is that this is a reality of humanization. This is a reality of thriving in the work we do. And most importantly, this is a reality of overcoming antagonisms. And see, Nick, this is the crucial matter, I think, and no one escapes this, and no employer who has any kind of sense of life in the world or even any kind of moral compass can escape this. The work we do, either it helps to overcome the antagonisms that surround us, or it exacerbates them. And so to train people in whatever they do in the ability to bring people together who would not be together, it is not simply an add-on to what they do. It will make it possible. Now, and let's be crass for a moment. It would make it more profitable for people who are concerned about the bottom line. A company that is known for not simply doing its work, but as it does its work, creates community, creates communion, creates a sense of belonging, not just with its employees, but with all who it services. That is very desirable. But for us, there's a moral calculus that must be acknowledged and in fact announced much more clearly.
We're coming into land now. I've got two questions, and they're both mercifully short and focused. The first one's from Ellie. The poems read were beautiful. Is it possible to share the authors? They're by you, aren't they?
They are all by me.
They're by you. And are they in After Whiteness?
They are.
They are.
Two. No, let's see. One of them is. The other two are. I have a collection coming, hopefully coming out soon, called A Time of Possession, and they will be in that collection.
Thank you very much. My final question, I think it's entirely appropriate that we return to Jesus and the crowds, which as I said, I think that's a particularly powerful message. Do you have in mind a particular moment in the Gospels, a particular story or particular encounter that best crystallizes what you've been talking about? A moment of encounter between Jesus and a crowd, or a person within the crowd, that best encapsulates this humanizing vision of what we need for education and indeed for wider flourishing. And what would that be and why?
Well, there are many, but let me just give one of my favorites, and that is when the woman with the issue of blood presses through the crowd and touches Jesus. And he stops in the middle of the crowd. And he said, "Who touched me? Someone touched me, because I sense power coming out of me." And it is the comments of the disciples after that that is so important. They're mystified. What do you mean? Everybody is touching you. Everyone is touching you. And that, for me, that response to Jesus is exactly what we want. Everyone is touching you.
Willie, thank you so much for giving of yourself tonight,
Pleasure.
for your warmth, your generosity, your wisdom, your provocation, your erudition. I also want to thank very much the Theos team who've been working on this lecture, particularly Anna and Pete and Abby and Maddie and Paul. I want to thank again CCLA for being such faithful supporters and partners of the Theos Annual Lecture over the years. I want to thank everybody who's turned up tonight, and hope you've enjoyed the experience as much as I have. We're hoping that next year's annual lecture will be IRL, as my children call it, in real life, in the flesh. But I guess we all know better than to plan too far ahead. Please watch the Theos website for news, listen to our podcast, join our Friends and Associates program. Do give your feedback on the lecture tonight. We'd be most interested to hear it. Our next event is on the 2nd of December to launch Hannah Ridge's report on building political consensus around inequality, and information about that will also be on our website. But it simply remains for me to thank again Professor Willie Jennings for an eloquent and a stimulating and a thoughtful and a provocative lecture. Thank you very much indeed.